Well, good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Hope this thing's working. I didn't realize I was the last session, so I'm not sure if that's good news or bad news for you guys. It looks like we actually had a pretty good turnout for this year's conference, so I'm glad to see everybody getting a chance to get out and learn a little bit more about performance excellence. I'm going to try to go over a couple points today to talk about what we call this process. Before you get into the strategic planning, there's supposed to be a first step, and that first step is supposed to be the strategic thinking. And I get to spend a lot of time with a lot of different executive teams, a lot of different leadership teams, when they're trying to put their strategies together, their plans for the next year, the next 2 or 3 years, and a lot of the same types of concerns come up. For example, they get everybody in the room and they say, okay, we're going to have a brainstorming session to come up with what our next big objectives need to be. So it's like, well, I call it ready, set, be creative. Right? And you're going to think as hard as you can for the next 2 hours, and you're going to come up with the list. And how effective is that normally? Usually, if you look at the list from year to year, you get the same list, right? Just with some updated numbers. Does that sound about right? It's okay. This is the last session. You can get it all out. You can. Yeah, that's what we normally find. Or people get a little frustrated, or you get, well, if we'd only known. And so I want to do is talk to you a little bit about today about what we've seen over the last couple of years to try to help you prepare a little bit more for actually creating that strategic plan. So a couple facts, a couple pieces of information I think is important to kick off with. First of all, if you talk to any of your CEOs, any of the people that really are the executive board for your organizations, they're going to tell you that growth is always number 1 or number 2 on their agenda. How do we grow our business? What do we need to do? And when they look at the basic plans, they're going to try to do that one of 2 ways. They're going to try to grow organically, in other words, take your existing clients, your existing products, try to grow more market share, try to get more of their pocketbook. Or you're going to try to merge, through M&A activities. And you always see a huge spate of those things come up. Even the banks now that were supposed to be too big to fail, they're merging like crazy now, picking up all the other ones that I guess don't want to issue mortgages anymore. The problem is when they do studies, like when Boston Consulting Group or Booz Allen or them do a study, invariably they find out that well more than half the time, any kind of M&A activity actually destroys the equity that the shareholders actually have. In other words, you're trying to merge companies or buy a company because you want things to get better, and what you find is that we're just not very good at that activity, and at least 62% of the time, the worth of the company actually comes down. So that's a problem. But then when you look at the other side and say, okay, well, let's do this from organic growth, well, we also find, and this is actually a little bit tenuous as well, and a lot has to do with the fact that we're just not always that innovative. So for example, in 1987, Forbes magazine came out with its 70th year anniversary edition. And they said, well, here's what we want to do. Let's go back and look at the Forbes 100 for the first year that came out, 1917, and now, and see how they compare. And what they found is only 18 of the original companies that were on that first list were still on the list 70 years later. Matter of fact, about 61 of them didn't even exist anymore as a company. Sometimes it was merger and acquisition. Sometimes the company just completely went away. So over that time frame, that 70 years, it was pretty tough, pretty hard to stay in that Forbes 100 list. As a matter of fact, of the 18 companies that were on the list, had you bought their stock and held it for that entire time, those 18 companies that managed to stay on the list would have underperformed the market by 20%. Meaning that even though they stayed on the list, it didn't necessarily mean that it was the best place to put your money from an investment standpoint. There was other things that came along. And that's kind of tough if you're thinking about the organic growths, and that's the way you were planning on growing your business. Matter of fact, of the 2 companies that actually outperformed the market over that time frame were General Electric and Kodak. So think about that, because that's in 1985. So if you fast forward to today, we all know Kodak is no longer there either, right? So that one went away, and we know GE is pretty much held flat. Matter of fact, GE doesn't really do a lot from the organic. It's much more about the M&A, and they tend to be one of the few companies that can get that right. If you look at the S&P 500 today, in other words, that was 1980-something. Did it get any better? So what does it look like? And in 2011, 23 companies were removed from the S&P 500. That means they were delisted. Their performance didn't warrant them even being on the stock exchange in that regard. On average, an S&P 500 company is now replaced about once every 2 weeks. All right? In 1985, if you were on there, you had an average lifespan about 61 years. Today, it's just 18 years. In other words, you're doing so good that you get added to the S&P 500 today, the chances are that 20 years from now, you will not be there. So things are a little bit different. And you know, the moral of the story is that companies really struggle to stay on top. What do we need to do to remain competitive? What do we need to do to be different from other people, to differentiate ourselves? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Where does that strategic thinking come from? Where do the ideas come from that actually enable us to defeat this curve that we're talking about? And here's where I think the basic problem comes from. And you can do a lot of research. You can study the Harvard Business Review journals. There's lots of books about it. There's lots of people that spend a lot more time than I do actually researching this. And I'm fortunate for that because I get to read their research. But if you look, 80% of top management's time is typically devoted to issues that account for less than 20% of what they're going to do to create long-term value. Would you agree with that? Many of you here today feel like you spend most of your time doing firefighting rather than really strategic breakthrough thinking. And that's what we see across the board. Matter of fact, if it was a major problem identified by the majority of senior executives was strategic thinking itself. And our executives really tend to spend most of their time getting carried away with details, right? And actually instead of spending time thinking about the broader big picture, right? We call this managing down. Right? Instead of handling things at their level, they start to handle the day-to-day issues, you know, much more often. Matter of fact, 85% of executive leadership teams spend less than 1 hour per month actually working on its unit strategy, and the other 15% spend no time at all. That's pretty startling, right? When you're trying to figure out why is it so hard for these companies to stay in the top 100? Why is it so hard to stay in the S&P 500? Well, what it looks like is we spend relatively little time actually working on the strategic thinking part. Okay, although companies find it difficult to change strategy for a lot of reasons, this one stands out. This is Clayton Christensen, is a well-known author about innovation. Basically says strategic thinking is just simply not a core managerial competency in most companies. We don't necessarily hire people for that, and we definitely don't groom people for that, okay? And so why is that? And what are some of the paradigms around the thinking? Why is it strategic thinking not a core managerial competence? And I think there's a lot of myths around it. One of them, I believe, is that people think that to be a strategic thinker, you've got to somehow be the smartest guy in the room every time, right? You know, what we'll do is we're going to go hire a couple strategic thinkers, and everybody else is going to wait until they come up with the good ideas, and then we're going to go do that. Well, the truth of it is that's not the way most good ideas come about. And what we're going to spend the balance of the time talking about is how can you guys become strategic thinkers? You know, how can we break through that paradigm? How do we leverage the strategic thinker that's really in all of us? So the first thing to do is really just talk about the concept of where does a good idea come from? Okay, and so usually when you hear some people talk about hey, where did you come up with that? You know, that was a fantastic idea. And somebody said, well, it just came to me in the middle of the night. Right? And we'll use terms like it was a stroke of brilliance or some kind of flash of genius or, you know, a eureka moment. You hear this concept of the epiphany. I can remember talking to several of my managers at times. Well, where'd you come up with that? Well, I was just sitting on the back porch one day and it just sort of hit me. You know, this is what we need to do. Right? You ever had one of those before? And I think we all think that that's exactly where these ideas come from. But here's what's interesting. As a matter of fact, I use a picture of a lightning bolt on purpose. And if you've ever actually seen a slow motion image of a ground strike from a lightning bolt, just before it gets close to the ground, you know what there is? There's another little shaft of lightning that actually comes up from the ground to meet it. Right? It's a back striker. And basically what happens is it sort of paves the way for that lightning bolt to come all the way down to the ground and make the final connection. And an idea is much like that, is we think that there's just some kind of flash, something that happens in an instant. What all these terms have in common is we think that an idea is just one something. And actually what we're finding out is an idea is pretty complex. It's more like a series of neurons in your brain. There's lots of different pieces of that idea that float around for a long time, and it's our job to figure out how to connect them together, right? How to make sure that little bolt of lightning comes up from the ground and meets the big bolt, and it does it in a very productive way. How can we take what we call our half ideas and connect it with other people's half ideas? And that's really the core to coming up with good strategic thinking in a strategic thinking process, is that great ideas seldom come in this stroke of brilliance. Usually ideas percolate over a long period of time. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a little bit of a groundswell, it takes some communication, it takes some collaboration to actually get most of these good ideas to come out. And so we're going to talk about how we can actually facilitate that. So the next myth that I'd like to break down is what I call going to the cave. And if I go and spend time with executive teams and I figure, okay, show me your strategic plan. Can they give me one? Well, actually, they can, and it's usually sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's usually some big book, right? And it's got all the things they're going to get done this year, and maybe even some for the following year. And the problem is that they're really frustrated about that plan because they're not getting to it very well, right? Because we're working on all this other stuff, but maybe the strategic plan is not something that we're spending as much time on as we thought we were supposed to. Part of the issue is that most of the time that strategic plan comes from what I call the cave. And it's where you get the top 20 or the top 40 or the top 100 executives. They go off sometime late in the fall, and they go off for 2 or 3 days off-site somewhere, and they come back with the book, right? Here is our plan. Ta-da, right? And you get ready to try to roll this out. Well, the problem is that when they come back and they start talking to you about the plan, you're going, where did this come from? What are you talking about? Why are we doing this instead of this, right? And what happens is you're trying to roll this thing out in January, and it ends up not being rolled out until probably February, March, or maybe April, right? Because you're still all the discussions back and forth with all the other people that really wanted to participate in the plan or trying to get buy-in, or even the fact you just haven't finished binding the book yet, right? And the problem is that this process actually has its origins in trying to get your annual plan for your company or your business or your plant put together in time for the November board meeting, in time for them to approve 2 or 3 things they've got to do so that you actually can roll it out. And it has nothing to do with where strategy actually comes from. So one of the distinctions we're going to make today is the difference between actually creating the plan, in other words, the strategic thinking that goes into it, and then actually the population and the execution, or the strategic planning part of it itself. And so the reality is that very, very little of strategy is actually created in the cave itself. So if it's not created in the cave, where is it? And what we want to tell people to do is the main distinction between thinking and the planning is that thinking occurs on an accrual basis. It happens a little bit every day. It happens in the office, and it happens in the car ride. Whereas strategic planning, actually putting it all together, the nuts and bolts of it, is something that probably could take place in a couple days and be incrementally improved as you start to deliver it to all the people that've got to go execute it. So we're going to talk today a lot more about the strategic thinking piece, okay? Because we don't believe that the strategic thinking is going to occur in that cave. Excuse me. So where does it occur? Well, quite honestly, I think it occurs in a lot of places that people don't give it credit for. It is the car ride into work, right? It is when you're actually out for a jog. It is when you're actually spending time talking with somebody, in your peer group. Sometimes strategic thinking occurs when you're not at work at all and you're not even thinking about work. It's when you're involved in something else, some other hobby or some other interest, and something does sort of occur to you. And you think it's an epiphany. You think, wow, I'm just having this moment, this flash. But what it is behind the scenes, your brain is actually connecting a lot of dots. It's connecting a lot of information that you've already been populating. Look at it like planting a field. Finally, things are starting to prop up and they're starting to grow, okay? And so what I get frustrated about the most is when I work with a lot of leadership teams who don't think that it's important for them to spend time in this sort of thinking exercise. Because what happens is they can't produce something at the end of the hour or the end of the day or the end of the week, right? Matter of fact, for some reason it's become a little bit unpopular to say, I'm thinking about it. Right? At least it is in my house. I've got 4 kids, and they ask me a question, and they'll go, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, if you want an answer right now, the answer is probably no. But if you give me a chance to think about it a little bit, right, then maybe the answer is going to change. You've been in that situation before? Well, unfortunately, we manage a lot of our projects and a lot of our companies the same way. If I need to make a decision right now, I'm going to give you the safest, most expeditious thing I can do. But if we actually took the time to think through things a little bit, we might not be as reluctant. And that's what we're going to try to give you as a formula for how you might go about doing that. Strategy occurs at many times and over time, but it seldom happens in that epiphany moment, and it seldom happens in getting the top 40 people to go off for 2 days into the cave, okay? What we have to do is we have to get better at collecting all of those dots. We have to get better at collecting all of those half ideas, if you will, and figure out how to share those on a regular, ongoing basis, because that's what the strategic thinking is. Remember, it's an accrual process. It's something that happens over time. It's not something that just happens, in bursts. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. You might know what this is a picture of. Sputnik, that's exactly right. And so, I think it was 1957, the Russians put Sputnik up into space, right? And this was a monumental moment that had never happened before. I mean, certain things we were trying to do, even in our own journey in the space race, you know, we're woefully behind the Russians for most of the time. Well, what's interesting is that one Monday morning, some guys walked into the APL, which is Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. And over that weekend, the Russians had put Sputnik into space. And you got to understand, at the APL laboratory, this is where, you know, all geeks, you know, desire to go and live. This is like geek heaven. When they die, this is where they get to go, is the APL. And so these 20-something guys, you know, 20-something-year-old guys were, you know, coming into work, and at the break table, this is what they're talking about. Hey, did you hear? And remember, they didn't read this on the internet. This is something they heard on the radio, and they didn't really understand everything that was going on. But they were super excited because somebody had finally been able to put something into outer space, and these are the type of projects that they would help with, you know, on the side, and they would work on. And so as they finished talking about it, two of the guys were coming back from the break room, and they go, you know, I wonder if anybody's actually tried to listen to that, you know, because it's up there and it's making a noise. It's pretty historic, you know. I mean, just, you know, we ought to, you know, at least go try. And so they actually, the two guys kind of wandered around the halls for a second, and they asked a couple other different people, have you thought about this? Have you thought about it? And nobody really had. But they were able to find somebody who actually in their office had some early microwave recording equipment, and said, well, you know, we should be able to find it in space. As a matter of fact, the Russians made it very loud, very noisy on purpose, because they didn't want anybody to think that it was a hoax. And so they did. They messed around with it for a couple hours and tweaked a couple dials, and I won't claim to understand how they actually did it, but they were actually to be able to pick up the pattern, and they heard it. And then they heard it doing all the little deep, 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 right in this pattern. And so they listened to it for a couple days. And as a matter of fact, other people knew, because they talked about it, you know, in the cafeteria, in the break room, that they were listening to this thing, and they would come by just to hear it, right? Again, I told you these were geeks, right? And they were listening to this stuff. And then finally somebody said, you know, are you recording that? Because, you know, really, somebody along the way is going to wish they had a recording of the first thing that was in space, and since we're probably one of the few labs that could actually do this, why not? So they didn't know how to do that, but they found somebody else that worked in the laboratory that had the type of recording equipment that they need, and they took it down to the office and they hooked it up. And you can just see over the course of time, as different pieces of equipment are getting added to this system, they were finally able to record it. Well, somebody else heard that they had a recording and started listening to it and said, you know, I'm really hearing differences in how long the beeps and the dashes last, and I think that based upon certain models, we can use the Doppler effect, and I can tell you whether or not this is going away from us or if it's coming closer to us. So they applied a little math to it, and sure enough, they could figure out which way it was going. And then they got to think about it a little bit more, and says, matter of fact, I think that if we look at the slope of the line, we can tell you how fast it's going. And they did it. They started working with this. And just again, this was something they were doing as a hobby, right? This was not their full-time day job. This is something they just had an interest in and they had a passion for. And so they did. And they did the calculations and they spent some time on it. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, what they realized is they had actually mapped the entire trajectory of the satellite around the Earth. They knew where it was going, how fast it was going. They could tell you where it was at any given time because it had a very repeatable pattern to it, which was kind of cool, right? So they had figured out a way to listen to it. They had figured out a way to record it. They had figured out a way to use the recordings to track its position and where it was at. Well, finally the boss got wind of how much time had been placed into this. And of course, it's just hard to ignore all the equipment that was in the room that wasn't in the room. And so he came by and he said, hey, listen, he gathered the two guys up and says, I understand you guys got a little bit of a skunk work project going on. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? You know. All right, well, I know you do. He said, and my understanding is that you've been able to figure out how to track an object in space that's at an unknown location, and now you can locate it, you can find it. And they go, yeah, that's true. That's what we've been able to do. Of course, it was never their intent. They didn't start out trying to do that. He goes, can you do it the other way? He goes, what do you mean? In other words, if we put something in space that was at a known location in space, could you then track something in an unknown location on the Earth? So they said, well, hang on a minute, let me think about it. And they took a couple days and went back and said, yeah, as a matter of fact, for some unknown reason to me, it's actually easier to do it that way. They said, yes, we actually can track things on the Earth to be a whole lot easier. You might need a couple of these satellites in space, but we can make it work. He said, good, because I've just been given a new project. At this point in time, remember, this is the Cold War, and we're just now figuring out submarine warfare. And somebody has designed a nuclear missile that'll go on a sub. But the problem is, if you don't know where your submarine is, it's hard to launch a missile and hit anything you're shooting at, and which can be kind of risky because you don't actually shoot yourself, for one thing, but you'd like to be able to hit what you're shooting at. And so they said, so what we'd like to be able to do is figure out, can we put a system in space that we can then find the submarine and give the coordinates to the submarine and tell them exactly where they are, so they can program that into the missile so the missile can hit what it's shooting at. And they said, well, yes, we think we can do that. And so what they actually created was GPS. Now, what's interesting to me is that these two guys sitting at the break table one day, just talking about something that was interesting to them and passionate to them, had nothing to do with what they were working on, asking enough questions, collaborating with enough people over the course of a couple months, we're able to go to a couple half ideas into something called GPS. And my guess is that every one of us in here are benefiting from this today. If you had to look up where the Indiana Convention Center was on your iPhone, or you had to figure out what time your next flight's going to be, or whatever it may be, we have GPS technology that we carry with us all the time, because what happened was eventually the U.S. government released it and said, look, it's not just for military purposes anymore. We're going to let it to the common market, and you guys do what you will with it. And the next thing you know, it sprouts up all over. And that's another type of collaboration. So to me, when I want to figure out where do good ideas come from, where does strategy come from, to me this is a great example, because you could say that the APL should have had a strategy to come up with a way of tracking submarines. But that was never given to them. You see, that was never what happened. That's something that resulted from the fact that these guys just kept pursuing ideas, and when the ideas were there and they were fertile, they could be harvested when it was appropriate. See where I'm going with that? And I thought that was a pretty cool story. And we call that collecting dots. So one of the first things we have to do as somebody that wants to be a strategic thinker is figure out, how can we collect more information like this? What can we do to help differentiate our strategy from everybody else's? And part of what we have to do is figure out how to collect more and more dots. And so here's the problem. If we work for, a pharmaceutical company or a construction company or a bank or, hospital or whatever, we can go out and hire the brightest people. But guess what? So are the other guys, right? That's what they're going to tell their people, right? That's what they're doing. If they're actually polling their customers and asking them, questions, well, they're polling the same customers that you are, right? If they have the same industry data and information that you've got, if all those things are the same, then what we have to assume that they're going to connect dots in the same way that you are, and really you don't have any competitive advantage at all. So the goal of strategic thinking that leads to the strategic strategy, the planning itself, has got to be to find better, more unique ways to connect all those dots. Okay? One of the first things we have to think about is, how do we actually find more information? How do we actually find more of those half ideas than the other guy, and then figure out a way to get those things connected on a regular basis? Okay? So here's what it looks like. We have basically a 3-step model that we like to talk to people about how we collect those dots, and then how we connect those half ideas that get created from that dot collection with other people's half ideas. Okay? And this is where I will tell you that I think it's very important as leaders that we take an ownership in making this happen, because again, when we say that most organizations don't have strategic thinking as a core competency, it's not something that they're valuing, it's not something they're spending time trying to encourage, that's an important point. Because even with this strategic model, it's got to be married up with a desire to want to have this happen. You're going to have to figure out ways within your organization to not just measure this process, but to encourage it, to make sure that's going to happen. So the first thing we call is the saturation phase. And what do we mean by that is, this is where your goal is to go out and get as many of these points as possible, and many of these dots, many of these half ideas that may be sitting out there. And again, this is hard to do in just 2 days, right, in the offsite in the cave. What we actually are looking for is a way to do this on a continual basis, something every day. Now the good news is I don't think this is as difficult as most people think it might be. So for example, just start with things that you already are interested in, your hobbies, things that are interesting, they don't even have to have anything to do with work. And you go, well, what do you mean by that? It's like, read your articles. Like if you're a Sports Illustrated guy, read that. If you like Discover magazine, Business Week, whatever. Try to have some varied reading interest. But for example, I'll give you a personal one. There was an article in Sports Illustrated a couple years ago. It was called The Hoops Whisperer. Anybody ever see that article? And what it was about was a guy that had absolutely no background in basketball whatsoever. He didn't even play basketball in high school, right? This guy was not an athlete, but he knew how to help manage and work with people, right? He was like a psychologist, if you will. And so what he did was he actually now is on contract to many of the best stars in the NBA, like a LeBron James, right? People like that, to help them improve how they play basketball. And you're going like, well, how can somebody that's never played basketball help and coach somebody like LeBron James on how to be a better basketball player? And so, because he doesn't know anything about it at all, right? And actually, that's his advantage. Because if LeBron James goes to the same people everybody else is, they're going to teach him about doing his jump shot or how to do a crossover dribble in the same ways that they're showing everybody else. Does that give LeBron an advantage? Absolutely not. So what this guy does is he actually challenges, and he actually comes from a completely different angle to explain to LeBron James why he's having problems and he's not having problems. And it actually is pretty phenomenal, the results that he actually gets. I only learned about that because I was reading the Sports Illustrated. You know, it was interesting to me because as part of my profession is trying to find new ways of helping other people. I said, you know what, his business model, the way he goes about doing it, makes a lot of sense to me. Now, you could say that there's nothing else to be learned there, but here's the other thing about studying these kind of journals is that I want ways to connect with people. Because remember, the story about the GPS was that those two guys started out being at the cafeteria table, right? Well, chances are they weren't there because they disliked each other. They were there because they had other things in common that they spent time talking about. So what you also want to be able to do is have some things that you have in common with other people that can start and spark conversations. Does that make sense? So that's one thing to consider. Here's another good example, is I think people need to pick a couple topics and they really need to drive some depth on it. So it's one thing to be a generalist. It's another thing to say, look, you know what? I have an interest in innovation, or I have an interest in communications. I have an interest in change management, whatever it is. Even if it's not part of your core job, you need to pick 2 or 3 things. You need to start driving some real depth in your knowledge and your understanding of that. Now, I recognize that there's some time constraints. So there's lots of resources out. Anybody have seen TED Talks before? If you haven't, you really go to TED.com. It's a great website. And they have hundreds and hundreds of short videos, 15-minute, 20-minute videos on all kinds of topics. It's a real good way to get the best of what the brightest people doing the best research have to say about particular topics. I don't have time to read all the books. There's some phenomenal number, like 3,000 books a day that get published. Nobody can keep up with all that. But there's services like Get Abstract that if you have particular subjects that you're involved with, you can go Google it. It'll give you a list of the best, most recent books. Each one of these things is only like 5 pages long, and you can read it and get the summary. And if you read a summary that's just so compelling, you can decide to go get that book. But chances are, if you get enough information right there from the abstracts to get you going, at least to make it relevant. So I encourage you, the next thing is not only you look at your hobbies and interests when you're in the saturation phase, but also pick 2 or 3 things and drive some depth. You also need to pick formats for your saturation that are favorable to your lifestyle. Lots of people now run and they have iPods and you know, you have the iPads and you have all kinds of access in this regard. So, you know, podcasts are a great way. And you can go, again, there's 3 or 4 different places. You don't just have to go to iTunes. There's lots of different places to do it. But even without the podcast, find some way that you don't have an excuse for not adding those dots into your system. I like making some of my stuff bite-sized. Like, for example, there's an example called the Intellectual Devotional. It's you can read a small couple pages every single day, and they have different volumes of this book, and it's on lots of different topics. And you go, well, why would this, you know, why would I want to read something about, you know, an old historian or an old author or something that happened, you know, back in the Revolutionary War? Well, it's actually pretty interesting to me how interrelated lots of different things actually are. Okay? And so sometimes when you read these little snippets, these little small pieces of information, it's that one thing that you needed to take your half idea and actually bring it to the top. Because remember, at the very beginning we say, where do good ideas come from? And people talk about the eureka moment, when the truth of it is that usually you've been dwelling on something for a while and you needed that one more thing to push you over the top. But you also have to look at keeping yourself very current. There's a lot of things going on every single day. And then finally, you know, what books are you reading? And I give you lots of different avenues for collecting dots, and books is the last one I talked about. And there's an old adage that I think is just as true today as it ever was. I think leaders are readers. And you know, if you want to get kind of scared, like I said, when I sit down with some of these executive teams and I ask them, what's the last 10 books that you've read? And it's crickets, you know, because they're struggling to come up with the last book that they've read. And they're like, well, does sport fishing count? And I'm like, well, it counts on the periodical table, but not here, right? You know, and so we actually, if we want to be considered strategic thinkers, that is not going to happen unless you're actually doing the homework to make that so. So you need to have a pretty healthy reading list. You should always have a book or two. You know, if you don't like to read, I'm sorry, but I don't know any other way. And if you every time you get information, if it's always completely distilled through some editor or somebody else, then you run the risk of not being able to connect the dots in a meaningful way for you. You also run the risk of not being able to connect the dots differently than your competitors, right? If they read the entire book and you didn't, you're at a disadvantage. So you need to look at your reading list. I actually encourage people, it sounds kind of corny, but to read books as a team. Get your entire leadership book, pick a book. It almost doesn't make any difference what the book is, and then share your reflective thoughts. And I'm always fascinated by how I'll read a book, and it'll say something to me. I'll have somebody on my team that reads the exact same book, and it says something completely different to them. I'm like, how did you get that out of it? But that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that different perspective and that ability to be able to collaborate. So what we say in that is that success favors the connected mind. The more dots that you have, the more connected that you're going to be, the better able you're going to be able to come up with those strategic insights that we're looking for. Okay? So once I get through that stage where I'm actually planting all the seeds, I'm saturating my brain, the problem is that you can overheat a little bit. You know, you have to have a period that you spend time thinking about it. And we call this the incubation phase. Okay? And incubation really refers to the time necessary to process all those dots. And actually all the research says that, believe it or not, the most effective time is between about 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. You know, when we ever say the term sleep on it, let me sleep on it, think about it, well, it's actually true that when you sleep on it, your brain is actually processing a lot of information. Matter of fact, a lot of stimulus that you've had throughout the day that you don't even recognize, something you saw, somebody walking down the street, something that was said in a meeting. Have you ever been in that situation where you're in a meeting, things are going pretty fast, it gets over with, and as you're thinking about the meeting, you sort of then remember a comment somebody said, hey, I think, Joe said this. Is that really what he said? How come I didn't recognize that? Because your brain is actually taking in way more information than your eyes and your ears can process at the same time. And it actually has to file all that stuff and catalog it. One of the effective techniques, though, to use when you incubate, very effective, is actually when you go to bed, is to plant a seed in your head about what it is you would like your brain to do. This sounds kind of silly, but say, look, I've got an issue. I need to have a story that I can tell my team to make them understand why communication is important, or I need to figure out a way to solve this problem. You actually can start to train your brain to plant that seed at the beginning, go to sleep, and you'll wake up and you'll be surprised at how that epiphany will actually happen, right? That moment will actually take place. So you have to find a way to actually build that incubation. So one of the things we talk about is this concept called looking at something a little bit more abstractly, looking at it from different angles when you get into the incubation phase. We call it actually creating what we call a mental model. And what I mean by that is that sometimes if you just have a whole host of dots and you've got no structure for how you're going to review that information, how you're going to collect it together, that can be really inefficient. So what we actually like to be able to do is say, okay, I have 2 or 3 different mental models for how I'm going to combine things, and I'm going to actually look at it. And actually the world's full of these mental models. You've seen Venn diagrams where you have 2 groups, 2 populations, and they come together in the middle. You say, what do these things have in common that are true in both of these worlds, both of these Venns? That's a mental model. So sometimes you can say, I'm going to analyze all this information, and I'm going to say, I think I'm going to put it in 2 groups, a high or a low, or a red or a green, and then I'm going to look for when they combine together, is there something in the middle? Is there some collision? That's a form of a mental model. One of the exercises that we do sometimes is we'll actually show on the screen 5 dots that are unconnected. And we tell people, say, real quickly draw on a piece of paper those 5 dots, and I want you to connect them however you think they need to be connected. And it's interesting to see all the different shapes and patterns that come up. Some people want to collect just the outside. Some people make stars out of it. Some people do different things. There's no right or wrong, but what happens is the more options you see in your mind, the different varieties you may actually have on the page. And if you're somebody that's never seen a curved line before, you might not think about connecting those dots with a curved line. Everything is a straight line. So we add to the mental model, we can actually say, look, I want you to connect all these dots, and I want you to only use curved lines. See, now I just created a model for myself that says, how am I going to go out and actually do that? I'll give you another example. There's a lot of research that talks about structured innovation and about, you can try this experiment with your team. Give them, say, 60 seconds and give a piece of paper and say, I want you to go out and I want you to make a list right now of all the things in the world that are the color white. and then let them go. And they'll make their list, and I don't know how many, 10, 15, 20 items maybe on the list. And then you come back to them and say, okay, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to create a list of all the things that are white that's in your refrigerator. And which list do you think is longest? The refrigerator list is almost always longest. And that doesn't make any sense because there's obviously more things in the world that are white than what's just in your refrigerator. Matter of fact, most of the things in my refrigerator are probably green or brown, right? So how does that work? Well, because what happens is we gave you a mental model. We gave you just enough structure because when you think about the world, you start off thinking about a cloud, and then you jump to cotton balls, and then you jump to something else, and your brain doesn't have a way of filtering that information and processing it very well, and that's actually a very inefficient model. If I gave you 10 minutes, the list for the world would be super long because you have time to bounce around. But because I say the refrigerator and I put just enough structure around it, then basically what people do is they close their eyes and do what? They start going down the shelves in the refrigerator, right? Oh, yeah, that's where I keep the rice from the old Chinese restaurant, and that's where I keep the milk. And they go down the list, and maybe the only question they come up with is, does it actually have to be white, or can it be in a white container? You know what I mean? How about the Cool Whip? Does that work? And so because you have just enough of a mental model, it actually makes you more efficient. So when we're in the incubation phase, what we want to do is we've collected thousands and thousands of pieces of information. You ask yourself these questions in some different ways. Create some mental models for yourself. Why is that important? Because the difference between your organization and somebody else's are going to be the way you combine these dots. It's called creating insight. And people that you talk to, they always seem to have a fresh way of looking at a problem, right? And they go, you know what? That's a really neat way of looking at it. Because what they've done is they've created some insight. They've created some new value out of all those dots. And that's what you actually want to have happen. Once I've done that, once I've saturated myself with this information, I've spent some time thinking about it, incubating on it, creating some mental models, creating some insights. Now it's actually time to illuminate. In other words, I want to start sharing this stuff with a lot more people so that I can complete these cycles over and over again. I want to find ways of taking these strategic thinking and eventually start to create the strategic planning process. And so there are lots of different tools that are out there. I'm just going to share a couple that we happen to use. So if everybody has done their homework, so I want you to imagine a process that instead of just saying, all right, you show up on Monday morning and we say, okay, ready, set, be creative. You know, give me all your ideas that you can. What we'll have done is we'll have made specified readings, requests. We'll have people being prepared for months in advance, collecting dots. Some of the things we'll tell them to do because we want the collective to have read the same books or articles. Sometimes we'll say, go do your own research and things that you think might be relative and bring new things to the table. But then when we start to try to provide some illumination, we give them a little bit more structure. We give them a mental model. So like, for example, if what we're focusing on is growth, remember that's how we started this whole thing, was that CEOs tend to focus on growth. We can say, well, look, we think there's 4 main buckets for growth. We call that core market, where you have your existing customers and the existing jobs that you already do for them. How can I expand? How can I steal market share? We look at where I can take disruptive growth, where I have certain things that I already do for a group of people, and I want to go out and find people that don't partake in my product or my service. How can I go in and treat them differently so they will actually come and work with me? Right? Or we call it related market growth, where we basically have the current customers and we find new ways of servicing them. Is there some service that we're not giving them that we should be, that we could be doing for them? And then, of course, the last one is probably the scariest for everybody, is I'm going to go to somebody that's not a customer, I'm going to offer them some service that I currently do not do in hopes of growing my business in new and profitable ways. So why would we do it? We create this model and we say, hey, look, I want for now, you've got a whole ton of ideas. Let's just focus on quadrant number 1. Then we look at the quadrant number 2, and we can move around because it gives us a more efficient way of actually creating some illumination. And once we do the exercise, we don't just stop. It's not like we do it one time. We'll actually take a pause, maybe come back the next week and pick up the exercise again now that people have had a chance to say, you know what, I'm not sure which of these 4 buckets this idea goes in. Or we look and we find out that we've got tons of ideas in 2 of them, but there are 2 of them that we scarcely have any ideas. So now I reset the game. I said, now I want you to go back for the next 2 weeks, and I want you to think about just ideas that are disruptive growth ideas. So here's some more definitions around that. Here's some ideas about how you might go and collect that information, but I've given my brain a specific task to go and think about. Another way that we look at it is what we call an innovation portfolio. So for example, we can take most all product innovations, most all design innovations, and we can categorize them as either product, process, or business model. And then we can look at them for their relative scale, how impressive they are, whether it's more incremental improvement or significant improvement, or really something that's actually breakthrough. So just a couple examples. Anybody recognize that screen? That's the iTunes homepage, right? And iTunes is a business model innovation. You know, everybody kind of looks at Apple and they think that the thing that really put them on, you know, this course they're on right now is the iPod itself. But the truth of it is the iPod came out, and after a year of having the iPod, their stock really didn't do anything different. I mean, matter of fact, was the MP3 player invented by Apple? The answer is no, it wasn't. Okay, there's plenty of MP3 players that are out there, and having music on a device has been out there for a long time. Now, I have to admit that there's maybe a little bit sexier, and they do some neat things with the screen, but the difference for Apple was not the MP3 player. The difference for them was iTunes. Now, if you go buy an iPod, you pay for that, right? You pay $100, $200, $300. You buy a phone, $500. How much do you pay for iTunes? Zero. You don't pay anything for that. Matter of fact, you get updates every other day, and you know you have to download them and stuff like that, but you don't pay anything for it. But what's interesting is they said, look, we're going to get into the music business, and of course at that moment in time, just because you sell an MP3 player doesn't mean you know anything about digital rights and the music and all that stuff. So somebody had the idea to break through and to say, look, we're going to be in the music distribution business. We'd like to have music that we sell end up on our iPod. How would we do that? Well, let's use iTunes. Let's create a software platform that allows that to happen. And of course, it didn't stop there. Right now, they distribute all kinds of applications through it and videos. And I mean, you know, you go to the app store, right? You have a whole lingo around. You know, there's an app for that, right? And this is actually a very interesting business model because now they sell things for like $1 a piece and stuff like that, and they're actually making a ton of money off of selling these little bitty apps. And the problem is that if you have an iPhone, you've usually got it because it was a convenient place to put your music, and you get ready to get rid of your iPhone. What's your problem? Now I'm not getting rid of just my music, I'm getting rid of all these other, you know, you got your calorie counter, you've got your exercise journal, you know, you've got your, you know, all your contacts, you know, you go down the list of, you know, all the different stuff that you have on this phone. You say, do I give up my phone, which is really my life organizer? You see what I mean? As a matter of fact, people bought the iPhone even when it wasn't a good phone. And so we use that as an example of a business model. And see what happens is you can actually use that example at your own place. Okay, you're not Apple, but can I say, how did their business model work? And is there some sort of analogy that I can make to my own business? Is there something that I can do that builds on what I do that same way Apple did? Here's another example of an incremental process improvement. You might recognize this screen capture. This is from Amazon, right? Now, many of you were using Amazon to buy your books, and of course, Amazon's growing by adding new products and services. But one of the clever things they did was add this one-click processing. Right? Because every time you went to go buy something, and what you got to understand is Amazon tracks all the screens that you've been through, right? All the places you went, everything that you did in there, they capture. And they were having a lot of people that would get to the point where they put something in their shopping cart and then decide to return it to the store. And that's them going, yay, oh, yay, oh. They don't want to ever say, oh no, once it's in the shopping cart, I want you to go home with it, right? So what do? They make it very easy for you. It's very convenient, right? Because you don't want to enter your address anymore and your credit card number and all this kind of stuff. So they said, look, all you got to do is fill this information in one time, give us permission, which is what you did, and when you hit one click, you don't think about it anymore, just go back to shopping, right? It's on its way. It's either going to send to your Kindle or it's going to go to your house. Very clever, right? Because the rate in which things got returned to the shopping cart plummets when you sign up for this service. So I know this is an example. They didn't have to do that much. They didn't really change much. I mean, this was a very quick programming thing for them, but it made a huge difference to their business. The last one is that I'll talk to you about is the McDonald's milkshake. Anybody bought a milkshake from McDonald's in the last 5 months or so? Nobody in here? This is the healthiest group of people I've run into in a long time. Yeah, there we go. Be proud. I have. You know, McDonald's sells 40% of its milkshakes before 10 o'clock in the morning. That makes sense. You're like, how in the world? That's a matter of fact, most of the growth in their milkshake business has happened in the last couple of years, and it's almost all happened in the morning. And the problem they have is, it's a good thing, is that they had to figure out why people bought milkshakes. And everybody thinks, well, it's because I want a dessert. Well, I mean, they're okay. They're not super great. I mean, you know, they're not like that, you know, I crave a McDonald's milkshake, right? But what was happening is that they had other jobs that they were doing. So what happens is that people would run through McDonald's real quick and they're getting ready to have a long commute. like a 30-minute commute or 40-minute commute, and they wanted something to do, something to eat, and just, a bag of French fries went away too fast. But a thick milkshake is something that could last a long time, right? So it actually occupies somebody. And that's one of the jobs to be done for the milkshake, was not just for flavor, not for eating, but actually to occupy the commute, the drive in. They found the same thing was true with parents with kids. Right? They're running through the mall. They have McDonald's that's right there in the mall, and the kids are sort of driving mom or dad crazy. They want a way to get them quiet. Go buy McDonald's milkshake. These things are super thick. They give them a really small straw. And they're, the eye's about to pop. Put the eye back in your head. What's wrong with you? But it was meant to occupy the child. And we can go through all the list of the reasons that they did. So what did they do? They said, well, you know what? We want to make our milkshakes just a little bit more attractive. So they got different kinds now, right? They add fruit in it, and they got different flavors, and they come in a different kind of cup and all that stuff. The whole reason why they did all that was because they recognized there were other jobs to be done besides just getting a milkshake to eat it because it's the world's best ice cream. And if they made it easier for you to do those other jobs, then you were going to buy our milkshakes even in the morning when it absolutely makes no sense to be drinking McDonald's milkshake. And so how did that come about? Well, they had to do some thinking, right? It wasn't like one day somebody just said, I want you to double milkshake sales. It doesn't work that way. That's how you do it if you do the planning part first and the thinking part later, right? What they had to do is figure out what are all the different potential things that are out there, and somebody noticed because they had kids and they said, you know what, this is the reason why I buy a milkshake is because I want my kids to quit yelling. Right? And that's what we're looking for. That simple little half idea, when it connected with some other people's half ideas, turns into this kind of innovation. And there's stories for every one of these sectors. So what we might do in this mental model is say, hey, look, now that I've spent time collecting, you've collected dots, I've collected dots, let's get together and shine a light. Let's illuminate all these half ideas and see how we can connect some things up. Where in our portfolio are we missing something that we need to go after? And that's one of the goals. That's one that we spend time doing. The last thing I'll talk to you about this and why this is so important is there's something called the S-curve. Any new product or any new service starts at the bottom there in the innovation phase, some new idea. And it might be a little troublesome. You have a great idea, everybody's excited about it, and you realize it's going to be a lot more work than you thought, and it kind of dips down. But eventually the ones that are going to live turn around. And they get on that long stretch where you actually keep improving the product and you're making some changes and some adaptions, and you're really riding the money train there. That's where you're making the most amount of money. The problem is that every product or service has a lifespan. It has a life cycle, and that's why it's so hard for those companies to stay, in the Fortune 100, right? It's so hard for them to stay in the S&P 500 because once they get that new product, they tend to ride it all the way to where? The grave, right? It's so hard to resist. I don't want to, this product's been making us a lot of money for 45 years. This is what we do. This is who we are, right? Let's just figure out a way to make it 2% cheaper. Right? Let's just figure out a way to make more of them and sell them overseas or whatever we do, and we call those extensions of the brand. That will last for just so long, and then eventually you have to do something different. 10 years ago, Apple was not selling music. Today, it's the #1 distributor for music, right? And you see what their stock is doing. There's a reason for that. We call it jumping to the next S-curve. You can optimize for just so long, but then you have to go. The problem is that what's the next S-curve to get on? Because the problem is that you never know exactly which is the right one. And there's nobody that can prognosticate and tell you for sure which is the right one. Did Apple get it right every time? Anybody heard the Newton? Half of you probably didn't. Some of you may have bought one and wish you hadn't. Right? I mean, they came out with a PDA. They came out with a way of trying to help people organize. They thought they could do that, and it flopped. It didn't work very well at all. But that didn't stop them from trying new things. And so what happens is that we want to take this portfolio of offerings, and we want to create a bunch of different starts to new S-curves, right? You got to get out and you got to try stuff, and you got to spend time innovating and trying new ideas because you don't know exactly which one's going to go. You have to create a portfolio, and hopefully what happens is within that little stable that you have there, one of those horses is going to be able to take off and is going to run. And where do all those little S-curve starts come from? They come from you guys. They come from you guys collecting up your half ideas and thinking about things in a meaningful way. So how do I bring it all together? We're almost done here. Most of us have experience. Some of it's bad, some of it's good. But if you don't develop expertise to go with that experience, then it's really not very meaningful at all. And what we mean by expertise is that you have to be able to take all those experiences you have and you actually have to start to create your own insights. That's what being an expert is supposed to be, is somebody that's got all the same experience as everybody else, but they've learned something that other people haven't. They figured it out. And where does that come from? It comes from strategic thinking. It comes from thinking about it. And I believe everybody is capable of doing that. Everybody is capable of creating an insight that says, you know, the number one reason why people buy milkshakes is not because it's such a great dessert. It's because it's something to do. It's something to keep people quiet. And you have to figure out how to create those insights on a continual basis. They act as that conduit from our experience and our expertise, and it's good when you actually combine your insights with other people of the organization. You share that. Strategic thinking is the creation of business insights on an ongoing basis to achieve the competitive advantage for your company, and that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? And it's different from the planning part that everybody spends all their time on. And planning is basically taking those insights and actually forming an action plan to achieve goals and objectives. So they're two completely different things, and they need to be done. Strategic planning is something you can do very quickly. You can put a plan together. The strategic thinking is something that has to take place over a long period of time. So strategic thinking is learning how to take experience, information, and insight and turning that into competitive advantage. And with that, I'm done. That's it. So actually, I think I'm about 7-8 minutes early. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take those for a few minutes from up here, and then I'll stick around for a little bit afterwards if somebody else has anything in particular. Yes.
One of the things that's a challenge is always buy-in to something that's very different than what has historically been done in the past. What are some tips you have for change management to folks that are naysayers who say there's no way, or want to instantly dive into details and obstacles?
You mean not everybody's gung-ho to change? Yeah, so I don't know if you heard her question was that, you know, one of the obstacles to wanting to create some of these innovative platforms is that there's a lot of people that are kind of stuck in today, right? And they don't necessarily want change to happen, or if they listen to what you have to say, they immediately start to drive into the details, which of course you probably don't have a lot of those details, right? You just want the opportunity. Is there any strategies around that? I think that that's true pretty much every company we go to. Even if you go to a Google or something like that who's supposed to be just known for their innovation, trust me, there are the process people that are in there every day saying, you better not do that to the website because you're going to break it, right? So there's nothing wrong with having some people that are a little bit more antagonistic and ask those kind of good questions. But I think what we're finding is that you have to have a core group of people that even if they can't bring that part of the tribe along, are still allowed to operate a little bit more independently. You almost create a group of people, not just, I'm not talking about an innovation department, but within each group, you're giving people permission to go and try stuff, even if the rest of the people aren't signed up for it. And so what happens is people want to say, well, I'm not going to start anything new unless I can get everybody to agree that this is what we're going to do. And that's not going to happen. And so we have to get people to say, look, you have permission. We call it consensus. We don't all agree that this is the right solution, but we have a consensus that we're going to let you try it, you know, within certain bounds. Like, you know, you can't spend all the money and all that kind of stuff. Now, if they create some artificial barriers, like, okay, well, you get no dollars and no people, then they're basically saying you can't do it. But what we're finding is that we have to be able to let people go try stuff even though the rest of the group is not on board. And it's okay for them not to be on board. Normally at the senior level, we think everybody has to agree, this is the plan going forward before we do it. There has to be some, right, this is what alignment is all about. But the truth of it is you got to try a bunch of different stuff before you figure out which way you're going. Cool. Any other questions? It is not. It is not. I'll see about getting it to you guys. Yeah, absolutely. If you want to drop a card off here, I'm happy to. I won't bug you about anything else, but I'm happy to get you the presentation. That's right. All right. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the lunch.